All right. What a fantastic video. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sarah Robson, and I'm the President and CEO of Marsh Canada. Let me commence our discussion with a sincere land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of the many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'd like us all to keep in mind that last year, the Government of Canada passed important legislation to make September 30th a federal statutory holiday called the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, in its commitment to reconciliation and ensuring that the tragic history and ongoing legacy of residential schools is never forgotten. We take this opportunity to recognize and commemorate the legacy of residential schools. As leaders in the industry, it's important for us to help drive change. And I'm immensely proud that Marsh McLennan is a global festival partner of the Dive-In Festival, as well as a gold sponsor here in Canada to drive sustainable change. I'd like to thank all of the sponsors of the event, including, in alphabetical order, Burns & Wilcox, you got to get this right, Burns & Wilcox, Chubb, CNA, HSB Canada, the Insurance Institute of Canada, Lloyd's, Markel, Marsh McLennan, ORIMS, Sun Life, Swiss Re, Toronto Women's Insurance Association, Travelers, and Willis Towers Watson. I hope I didn't miss any off that logo. Running for its 8th consecutive year, Dive-In's 2020 theme is #Braver Cultures. A braver work culture is one where we intentionally take steps to support a diverse and inclusive workplace where colleagues feel a sense of belonging. Today's panel will consider how the pandemic has altered employee expectations, shaped new work environments, and impacted women and diverse colleagues in the workplace. We hope that you will leave this session this morning with a better understanding of what is needed to create a more inclusive workplace where all colleagues feel a sense of belonging as we navigate a hybrid work environment. Creating a platform for meaningful conversation is our goal, and I'm excited to welcome you all to today's panel discussion. Before I turn it over to Jaqui Parchment to introduce the panel, I just wanted to acknowledge John Doyle, who is our Group President and Chief Operating Officer, and has announced as recently as yesterday, starting January 1st, the Marsh McLennan Company's Chief Executive Officer. John, welcome. And with that, I would now like to introduce our moderator today, my esteemed colleague, Jaqui Parchment, who's the CEO of Mercer Canada. Over to you, Jaqui.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks to everyone who's here with us in person, but I know we also have a really large virtual audience of almost 500 people who have signed up for this very important conversation. It's my great pleasure to start by introducing our fantastic panel. The three women that you see in front of you today are powerhouses who've all made different choices, but important choices that allow them to serve our country in really important ways. So first, Angelita Graham, who is our Toronto office leader for Mercer. Angelita leads a team of over 500 people. She's an actuary by background, but does not let that define her. although she has served on the board of the Canadian Institute of Actuaries, but she also serves our community in a number of different ways. So we're delighted to have her perspective here this morning. Zabeen Herji, who's had a number of acts in a really esteemed career. So her last formal full-time role was CHRO of RBC, really important, and one of a very few senior women of color who served in the C-suite of Canada. But really importantly, she's chosen her third act to be purposeful, serves in a number of different ways, serves on an important corporate board, but also serves our community through education, through mentorship, and we're really grateful to have her here. I should say Zabine is a really effective social media maven. I don't know if that's a cool term. I don't know. I threw it out there. I thought it would be cool, but takes a lot of time to think about how she influences and can get really critical thought leadership out using social media. So I would encourage you to follow her if you don't already do so. And last but not least, Dr. Wendy Cukier. And Wendy is the head of, let me get this right, the Toronto Metropolitan University Diversity Institute. She's done many, many important things in her career, but most recently has helped advise the government on how to incorporate more diversity into Canadian boards. So great to have everybody here this morning. Maybe a round of applause to welcome them. We're at a really pivotal time. So coming into COVID, I think we all recognized that we faced an unequal workplace. COVID in many ways ripped the Band-Aid off in terms of exposing inequality. And then we've had a number of other really painful events that have allowed us to see maybe what some of us did not see before. So really important conversation to be having, but I know from talking to all three of our panelists, we all want to talk not just about where we've been, but where we're going and how we can do better. So Angelita, let me start with you. Sarah alluded to the concept of belonging at the start of the conversation. Can you talk a little bit about belonging in the workplace and maybe how different groups, women, men, and people of different ethnicities, some of the stats around how they view belonging, and we'll go from there.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. So first of all, let me say I'm really happy to be a part of this wonderful panel to really have this important conversation. So as employees, we all want to feel a sense of belonging. That is the need to be included and treated fairly in the work environment. And long before the pandemic, we saw that women and people of color and other minority groups were having different work experiences, from the sense of inequity in career advancement to their overall well-being. And I think what the pandemic did was help to highlight and in some cases amplify the difference in experiences that individuals were having. And in our recent global talent trend survey that we did, we saw that employees who said that they were thriving or they felt that they belong in the workforce more likely to say that the workplace culture was inclusive. They were more likely to see that they saw good representation in terms of women and minority groups in senior leadership positions. They were more likely to see, at least up to 2 times more likely to see that their needs were being met and they felt emotionally supported by their organization. And when we look further into the data, we saw that there was a 20% gap in terms of women in the organization that seeing that they were able to thrive relative to men. And more broadly, in other research that we did, we found that men, or at least I should say people of color, were feeling a sense of that their workplace culture was unhealthy. And we saw similar information in the data as well for Canadian women. So really, the data is telling us that our women, our people of color, other minority groups are feeling that they don't belong in the workplace because of the inequities that they're facing in the workplace.
So that's very unfortunate. There may be a relationship between that feeling of belonging and mental health and wellness. Can you talk a little bit about mental health and how different groups are feeling about their ability to thrive and be mentally healthy?
Sure. I think it kind of goes back to part of what I was saying, because the gap that we're seeing in experiences that people of color and the women are having in the organization creates an issue in terms of our talent pipeline that's already just a gap with diverse talent. And we know that individuals who feel that they can thrive in the environment are more likely to stay. And well-being seems to be a really top concern for employees. Like we found in the data that 1 in 3 employees said that they would give up a pay increase in order to get additional benefits.
Wow.
So that is important. And when we spoke with employees in our Inside Employees Mind survey, we found that mental health ranked number 2 for women and people of color. So there is really that sense of the need, and I think the pandemic kind of helped to make it even worse for women, I guess, because of some of the burden that they were bearing. But there's really that need to address mental health in the workplace, because what we found that many traditional benefit plans really are not really looking at from the lens of inclusivity in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of gender, in terms of race. So there's a lack of inclusivity in some of the benefits that we've seen. And the good news, I would say, is that Canadian organizations rank mental health as number 3, right? But I think there's an opportunity to do more. And what I mean by that is when we look at the data, just over 60% of Canadian organizations were addressing mental health adequately. And the other surprising thing is that less than 60% were dealing with burnout. And burnout is also a factor of mental health. So there is a gap there as well in terms of like all the factors that impact mental health in the environment not completely being addressed by employers. So that said, I think there's an opportunity to make sure that you have more inclusive benefits. Are your benefits meeting the diverse needs of your population? So it's really going to start with data, really looking at the data and then assessing and reviewing the gaps in your benefit program relative to the diverse population that you have. And the last thing I would say is, look at how can we pull back on some of the stressors that people of color and women are feeling in the environment in terms of the microaggression that they're feeling in the environment, maybe stigma around mental health issues that are in the environment.
Thank you. Sabine, Wendy, is there anything that you'd like to add to Angelita's thoughts on the data?
Sure, I'll jump in. Just to pick up on the belonging theme here, one of the things that we're seeing both through surveys as well as anecdotally with organizations and individuals that I speak with is that we're hearing that particularly people of color have in this world of hybrid, which is generally where most people are, they are more reluctant to come back into the office. And the reason for that is what Angelita talked about, which is the culture, the microaggressions, and even the overt racism that they face, and in their homes, they are more protected from that. And so what's happening is some organizations are saying, oh, this is a good way for us to attract more diverse talent because now we have the opportunity for them to work. That is the wrong answer. The issue really around what are organizations actually doing to address that, where we started on that path, we need to accelerate that, not decelerate that. Because what the whole premise and what employees want is flexibility, choice. And people in this world of hybrid, everyone should have the same kind of opportunity to make the right choices. And the issue of proximity bias really plays into it. Having spent my career as a banker, I saw that a lot, this issue of proximity bias. And it's not just in the workplace, it's what happens after work. And, in some areas like Quebec, it's 5 à 7, right? After work, people, it's a very different culture socially, and in many European countries, that's the case too. And that's where relationships are built, that's where networks are built, and that has had a huge career impact. What I'm seeing happening now is, and keep your eye out for that, in restaurants, on patios, at lunchtime, it's now looking like what it used to look like after work. It's predominantly men, and it's predominantly white men. And so what is happening there, and how are we going to address the whole workplace culture issue to ensure that we are actually making it possible for people to benefit from some of the things that come from being together. And, you know, everyone here and our listeners can really play a role around that and engaging our employees to understand that issue more and to take action with some urgency. Because we can get into ghettoization, right?
100%. I think we are singing in the same choir, Sabine. And I love that you call that out, and you call that out publicly, and you continue to do that very openly. Because unless we're unafraid, you know, we talk about braver work cultures. Unless we have the courage to be real and to talk about these issues really openly, there's a lot that can hidden, and we can take a really big step backwards. You know, in addition to, you know, we can talk about proximity bias, but I'll speak very personally and say that in many ways, my career was shaped by sponsors. To sponsor someone, you have to believe in them, you have to know them. And so the idea that we could end up in a situation where it's mainly white men that are physically going into work, connecting with senior leaders, and building that trust and that connection, I find, quite frankly, terrifying. So let's continue to talk openly. So let's pivot. And Wendy, you have been very open about something called the 50-30 challenge. Would love to hear that defined, and then talk about how you think that that challenge can move us forward. Our efforts.
I did not read the memo. So the Diversity Institute's been doing research and running pilot projects, working with organizations for about 20 years, trying to really use evidence and research to drive change. And so when we think about some of the issues that have already been raised by the panel, when we think about the state of representation, diversity, and inclusion in Canada, it's clear that we have made some progress, but there's a long ways to go. And when you try to unpack what the factors are that really present barriers, whether it's to women or racialized people, the Black community in particular, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and the LGBTQ2S+ community, what you see is that the barriers are really at multiple levels. Organizations don't exist in a vacuum. So assumptions we have about who leaders are, what leadership characteristics are important, et cetera, really shape very often who is seen as leaders in organizations. Things like access to childcare, policies, infrastructure, phenomenal impact on who has opportunities and who doesn't. And the media plays a really important role. Organizations themselves, though, of course, can make choices. And, you know, our sort of seminal study we've been doing for 15 years or so is called Diversity Leads, which just tracks representation of women and racialized people in leadership roles. And one of the really interesting things is that overall we see that women have made some progress, maybe 25% now, depending on which data set you look at in terms of board leadership, but racialized people much less so. And so look at Toronto, for instance. Half the population is women, half the population is racialized. But when you look at representation in leadership roles, what you see is women across sectors about 30%, 38%. Racialized people, 15%. And when you start breaking that down even further, we did a study, for example, of 1,600 corporate board members across Canada. There were exactly 9 Black men and 4 Black women, and Indigenous people were almost invisible. In Toronto, where half the population's racialized, half the population's white, white women outnumber racialized women on corporate boards by 12-1. So the point, I guess, that I'm making is that we are making progress, but unevenly. And I would be the last person to say that we have achieved what we need to with respect to gender representation, but I would be the first person to say there are other segments of the population that we really need to focus on. And when you talk about things like sponsorship and mentorship and opportunities, we have to take those things into account. So I would never suggest that one initiative will make all the difference. But I think we need, when we understand the system is complex, we have to think about multiple approaches. So many of you probably know about the Black North initiative. Some of you may know about the 30% Club. In fact, I think there are probably members in the room who are part of that. And the 50-30 challenge is similar. It's a voluntary code that organizations, whether the private sector, small, medium, large organizations, nonprofits, and so on, can simply make a commitment that they will strive to achieve gender parity, that's the 50, and increase diversity, that's the 30. And what I like about the 50-30 challenge, it's clear, but the 30% allows you to consider context. So I described the situation in Toronto where half the population is racialized. St. John's, Newfoundland, not so much. And so it doesn't make sense in my mind to set targets in St. John's, Newfoundland for representation of racialized people that are the same in Toronto. So that's why the 30% is kind of, in my view, helpful, because it allows you to define diversity in an appropriate way for your sector and your context. And so right now there are about 1,600 organizations that have committed to the 50-30 challenge. And we know that you can't change what's at the top of the house if you're not also looking at your HR practices, your culture, your policies, your procedures, and I would even argue your value chain, because the best EDI practices and strategies are ones that are embedded in every element of the corporate strategy. So there's a lot of work, a lot of different organizations that are trying to move this forward. It's one thing. It's only one thing. But I think we've already seen evidence that it's making a difference.
Thank you so much for that. Sabine, did you want to, I know you do a lot of work with boards, anything to add?
Always have something to add. So maybe just a few, picking up on Wendy's framing, and that report that's done is fantastic. I always look forward to it and read it with great interest and quote it a lot, because the data says a lot. In terms of practical, sort of what can we do about it, the one thing I would say, and this is more around women, but also more broadly around the issue of talent and culture, there are very few HR leaders on boards. The U.S. has actually made more headway there. They're very actively brought on HR leaders onto boards, and HR leaders, DEI leaders, it's not happening in Canada. At one point, I counted, I think, 5 on TSX 100 companies. That is a huge opportunity, not just in terms of gender diversity, because most HR leaders are not that. They're women, but they're not that, they're not from racialized communities, et cetera. But, and that's the biggest issue. CEOs today say talent is the biggest issue. And that the contribution and sustainability leaders as well would be another area where you can certainly get gender diversity. In terms of sponsorship, I think that's another huge opportunity for current directors to identify someone that they can, there may need to be some mentorship along the way, but, you know, leaders can sit on boards. It's not that complicated. If you are willing to learn and you bring, I mean, many leaders, I mean, I sat at the RBC board as a management committee member for 10 years. I learned a lot about boards through that. So active sponsorship is really, really critical, and that's how I've not chosen to make corporate board work a big part of my portfolio. I've won board, but that came from my sponsor, my former boss, the former CEO of RBC, and the sponsorship was not just around, I'm on the board of Sleep Country, it's a mid-sized company, but what he really pitched was, I sat at the C-suite of RBC. I have a purview of the entire organization. I can bring retail is retail, and retail is detail too, but I can certainly bring digital, customer experience, risk management into that mid-sized company and help Canadian companies grow. So to me, those are, really sort of practical actions. And then the third thing, I like to speak in threes, is I think it's time to really start to look at some sort of goals. In the UK, for example, for the large companies on the FTSE, they have goals, requirements for women as well as for minorities. One minority on the board is where they went, and that is making a difference. And the person needs to be from the UK. So it's not about bringing someone from another place to give them international exposure. And so I'm a big proponent of that as an accelerator. And people make good decisions. This issue of we don't have qualified candidates. If you look hard enough and you think more broadly about what you want to bring, tech skills is the other area. Lots of younger tech entrepreneurs that could bring a whole different piece, and they tend to be, there's a lot of diversity there. So those are a few sort of practical, you said be open, talk about some of the challenging issues and opportunities, and those are some things that I see.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Sabine. And maybe I'll share a little bit of our corporate experience. One of the things that we do here at Marsh McLennan in Canada is to require a very simple thing that for every role we have a diverse slate of candidates, and a true diverse slate, not let's throw in somebody that can't get the job to tick the box. And what we found from that is the world of work is changing, right? The future is changing, and without even knowing it, you can create a box for what you think is an appropriate hire for your company, not just around race or gender, but other skill sets as well. And by insisting on that diverse slate, we've forced ourselves to think outside the box, and we're ending up with even more amazing candidates than we had before. And sometimes those individuals are women or racially diverse, and sometimes they just bring something we didn't know we needed. So thank you for that comment. Angelita, we've talked a lot about mentorship and sponsorship. Can you, it may seem obvious to most of us, but can you talk a little bit about the difference and why sponsorship is so important versus mentorship?
Thanks, Jaqui. So I think sponsorship versus mentorship, in terms of when I think about mentorship, it's really maybe following behind someone, learning the details of the job that you're doing and understanding that, so you're learning from them on the spot. But sponsorship really is around having someone be your advocate. So there's then a voice for you in the boardroom, in the executive conversation, to say, this person, this candidate, I believe in this person, they can do it. And I've been fortunate along the way that my journey, that I've had some great sponsors that have really pushed me forward give me the, I guess, strength when I think that maybe I shouldn't go for this role, to tap me on the shoulder and say, I do believe you should go for this role. And I think my position today is because of my sponsor who said, maybe you should apply for this role because I think you can do it. So sponsorship is very important. It's about advocating for the individual to get that person in the role. And I think what we find is, and it's been mentioned before by the other panelists, is that women and people of color don't have enough sponsors. They don't have enough individuals who are looking out for them, advocating on their behalf to help them to that next level. So it's not that they can't do the job, it's that they don't have anyone tapping them on the shoulder. And part of that goes back to having access to senior leaders, that they're not able to have as much access as maybe other groups, because maybe the after hours conversation, the golfing, the different ways that people socialize, they may be excluded from those events, and that impacts their ability to build relationship with individuals who can be their sponsor. So building a relationship with those individuals is important. So really, I think for us as leaders, we have to be more deliberate in terms of identifying candidates and really advocating on their behalf. So I would say that's the last point I would make on that.
Thank you so much for that. Sabine, back to you. You opened the door a little bit on the conversation about the future of work, return to office. Can you tell us how you're thinking about that, and all the different kinds of workers that you're thinking about as part of that conversation?
Yeah, that's the topic du jour for sure. Return to office. So let me start really with what I see as important context. A lot of the conversation we're having is around office workers. That's about 40% of the workforce. There's 60% of the workforce that cannot do their work from home or from somewhere else. And I'm going to come back to that for a moment, because I feel very strongly that we need to be having more conversations and actions around that group that's also looking for a different work experience. What happened during the pandemic is quite profound. As individuals, we really stepped back and we reflected on life and work and how the two play together. And this, we had a lot of time, and we had a lot of experiences around that time where we stepped back, and what I'm seeing is this shift from work first, then life, to life first, then work. And in the North American cultures, in the Canadian-U.S. culture, the work first, life next is a stronger part of our cultures. In many European countries, there is a bit more of a balance or even a life first concept. But that's what's causing a lot of what's happening with individuals that are saying, you know, I am going to reset. It's not the great resignation that we talk about a lot, is really, a lot of it is about the great reset, the great rethink. And what's happened during the pandemic, the other profound change is, as individuals, we are more courageous to take some of these decisions, to maybe take some of these risks, and we're also more confident. We made it through 2.5 years of a really, really difficult time at work, with life, homeschooling, parental care, being sick, being afraid of being sick, loved ones being sick, losing people. And we realized that we are a lot more resilient and are capable of doing a lot if we really put our mind to it. And so as employers are thinking about it, I would love to see this framing and this conversation around what does life first and work mean, and how that is not anti-productivity and performance. There are a lot of studies that show that, you know, beyond a certain number of hours of working, you have diminishing returns. Healthy workers' well-being is critical to performance. Two sides of the same coin, performance and mental health and well-being. So with that sort of as the overall framing and what's happening to return to office, people are looking for flexibility, choice, and autonomy. Those are the things that we had working from home. And so organizations, if I were to generalize, are really moving to a hybrid model. There are some that are remote first. There's some that are for office workers that are in the office all the time. But generally, it's a reasonably normal distribution in terms of what people are doing. Of course, the hybrid, the two ends, it's pretty straightforward, just in terms of what's happening. It's in the hybrid space that people are still thinking it through, experimenting. There's everything. But generally, 2 to 3 days is kind of the range that people are looking at. And some are fixing the days, some are not. There's no right answer, but it's understanding. I understand why organizations fix the days, because if you come to work and you're on Zoom calls all day, it's pointless. I understand that employees are looking for more flexibility so that it can fit into their lives. How we move forward, though, and what I'm not seeing enough of is these open, candid conversations with employees where we're really talking about the needs of employees, of clients, of shareholders or owners, and community, because not being in the downtown areas has a huge impact on our communities as well, on our small businesses that survive and thrive because of that. And how do we really try to get back into this partnership with employees, with candor, with humility, with a lot of experimentation, and really find ways to measure performance. We didn't have good measures of performance for knowledge workers, office workers before the pandemic. Like many things, the pandemic has shone a light on that. We used FaceTime, and I mean not the FaceTime, but people in the office as a proxy for productivity. Well, it's not. And so how do we really move to looking at outcomes as opposed to activities and inputs? And we need to do that with employees. We need to create measures that we can jointly agree on, that people trust and use their knowledge to really move that forward. Because employee voice has really risen through the pandemic, and that's a good thing. So how do we harness that for them to thrive, as well as for organizations to thrive? And of course, what we're seeing when that's not happening is the employee voice is moving to employee activism. You want the conversations to start in your own organizations and not move to outside the organizations because they can't be solved there. So, I would sort of sum up in terms of what's happening with ensuring the principles of flexibility, choice, and autonomy are there. And actually, the thing I said I would come back to was the 60%. Very little is happening around those workers. We have skill shortages in those areas. We didn't before. I mean, certainly we did in healthcare and things like that, but as far as retail jobs, service jobs, hospitality jobs, we need to provide that, and that's things like giving people lots of notice for their shifts. It's allowing people to actually switch shifts with criteria, with a framework, but a way that gives them some of that autonomy. And some organizations, there's a small municipality in Ontario where their garbage collection, and the workers work 4 days a week. They get the same work done. I think they work an extra hour a day, whatever. But how do we really think creatively, and how do we also look at the times that people work as well? It's not just, if people are coming in, they want to drop their kids off to school. They see the joy that comes from that. And I remember that struggle for me when my kids were young and I wasn't able to do that, and how much they loved it when I could do it occasionally. But So why not have, if you have a fixed day, make it 9 or 10 to 2. It doesn't have to be all day. So how can you create that win-win? And that's what we're trying to do.
I love that. I love that sense of innovation and how we can make things better for everyone. Wendy, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the reality that a lot of employers are starting to confront is demographics, right? The boomers are, dying or retiring, and I want to do the second before the first. But we've talked about those demographic shifts. I think it was actually RBC at around 2000 started talking about the impact of demographics, and I think in some ways COVID just sort of pushed that off, and so that's a huge issue because we're losing experienced talent. Young people, when Sabine talks about shifts in attitudes among workers, I think there's a real generational difference. 30% of young people, we did a project with Environics recently, said they had changed jobs in the last 2 years in order to have more flexibility. They, for sure, will make decisions based on the work environment, culture, and so on, way more than other things, and it's becoming a job seekers market in some respects. So I think that's putting even more pressure on employers to get some of this right. But one of the challenges is often the leadership is my vintage, and we grew up in the I started my career in consulting where we were really cannon fodder for the partners, and everyone bragged about how many hours you worked because I worked 24 hours yesterday, oh slacker, I worked 35, right? And so you've got a generation of sort of my vintage that came up through that system. We see it in education as well, and it requires a huge reset in terms of how we think about employees, how we think about work, and so on. And I think that's a huge challenge, is shifting notions of leadership, reskilling leaders for this new environment. And the only other thing I wanted to mention is, in my view, there are labor shortages, there are skill shortages, but we also have a lot of employers looking for skills in all the wrong places. 40% of engineers who are trained outside of Canada are underemployed. And one of the encouraging things I've seen post-COVID is even a lot of SMEs in small communities are now coming to us and saying, can you help us find some newcomers? Because they're opening their minds to opportunities. There's a big push, with discoverability, for example, to find ways to integrate persons with disabilities, more programs really targeting pathways for Indigenous peoples because Indigenous youth are the fastest growing segment of the population, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think the demographic pressures coupled with changing views and attitudes are helping to drive the diversity and inclusion agenda.
I love that, and Canada is an amazing country and one of the very few places in the world where there's almost no disagreement around the value of immigration, right? Our politicians, our business community, our unions, all united in that. So how do we make sure that the engineer who comes here can be an engineer and not a cab driver?
And if I can, Australia's eating our lunch on this. We just looked at some data. In Australia, whether you're looking at nurses, physicians, engineers, whatever, immigrants will earn 90% of what Australian-born workers will earn within a matter of 2 to 3 years. Canada, 50%. Like, we are doing such a terrible job, and it's a global market. We're competing now for talent globally. We have to get this right.
Thank you for that. All right, this has been an amazing conversation. We're running up against the clock here. So maybe just a couple of minutes from each of you. What gives you hope? So I'm going to start with you, Sabine. What gives you hope for the future that we're going to get this right?
A lot. actually. And for me, the one of the other big changes that has occurred is, and I talk about it as the future of leadership is human, and the future is now. But what happened again during the pandemic is we really united as human beings. It was the shared humanity in common predicament, common purpose, where leaders and workers more broadly, some of those, the barriers, the hierarchies really were broken down because we were facing so many similar things. And we were also inviting people into our homes through our Zoom calls. And as we watched, the children traipsing around, I really enjoyed that, or the misbehaved pets, you'd see a cat come over someone's shoulder. But there was something quite special, and we saw things, behaviors like empathy and compassion. We saw a lot more authenticity because there we were, and hopefully none of you were pajama-less and stood up like one of our MPs did. And I'm hopeful because the authenticity and vulnerability, we didn't have answers. We had to bring our people into conversations and say that we don't know how we're going to address this. We need your help. We need to solve this together. But what I see happening is a lot of leaders really like this. We like being human. We don't want to be something at work and something different at home. And there is a risk if we're not deliberate about really embedding this into our organizations. And I'm seeing some organizations update their leadership competency models, for example, and put things like empathy. I had a board chair the other day say, Sabine, how can I tell if my CEO is being empathetic? So it is happening. Let's embed it. And be inspired. Jacinda Ardern is certainly a leader that's inspired me, and she says, you can be strong and empathetic, and I would say you can't be strong if you're not empathetic.
Thank you for that, and I would love to have been a fly on the wall for that conversation around how can you tell if your CEO is empathetic. I think that's an interesting question. Okay, Angelita, a couple minutes from you. What gives you hope?
I think in addition to all that Sabina said, I think really it is great to see that although we mentioned about the data, we see so many employers are now really, really leaning in. The conversation in the boardroom at the executive level is all about how can we support our employees, women, people of color. So I'm really energized by the fact of the conversation that's happening and the actions that are being taken. And leaders are being very, very transparent. They're saying, we don't know, can you help us understand the culture, help us understand what are the actions that we need to take in order to make our experiences for our colleagues, our diverse colleagues better. So I'm really excited. I feel now more than ever. I mean, I know there are times when people said, maybe this will change. No, I feel as if that we are on the right trajectory and that there's the energy and there's the determination and the focus to get it done. So I'm really excited about it.
Thank you for that. And Wendy, last word to you.
I'm kind of a glass half full, glass half empty girl, but I'll try to focus on the half full. I do think we see conversations, we see intentionality that we haven't seen before. I have to say, though, that there is a risk that it's all about the statements and the rainbow flags, et cetera, and we really have to hold people accountable to move from intention to action, in my view. But for me, one of the most inspiring things in the last few years has been the ability to adapt, innovate, and be resilient, and things that people said would never happen. You know, online learning, we can't do that, digital diploma mills, right? Universities transitioned virtually overnight. Resistance to flexible work hours. In the government, that was a huge impediment to their diversity hires, for example. You had to be here, security and all this stuff. And they pivoted. You know, programs and policies and services were launched within weeks that normally would have taken years. We saw SMEs decimated, but we also saw some pivot very quickly and grow phenomenally. Like some of the progress among women entrepreneurs and others, it's a whole nother discussion, but went from local markets to global markets because of digitization and so on. So if you think about the change, and you think about change as a positive thing, not just a negative thing, that we've undergone in the last 2.5 years, the rate of change, the openness to change, the ability to innovate and move forward, if we can hang on to some of those lessons and frankly apply what we know about innovation to these issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, I think we can really make progress much more quickly than anybody thinks possible.
Thank you for that. Well, it has been my great honor to share the stage with all three of you, and a lot of fun. So unfortunately, our time's at an end, so I'm going to turn it back to Lexi to close us out.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Jackie, Zabine, Wendy, and Angelita for this really important discussion this morning. I am hopeful after today's session, and I really hope that you are too. There's a lot that we can take away from this conversation. I loved what Jackie had to say about it being a pivotal time, and that unless we are unafraid and real, there's a lot that's hidden and we can take a step backwards. And also the importance of sponsorship. And it's really time to start looking at goals and openly discussing challenges. I thought that Zabine's comments were really impactful in terms of the need to accelerate inclusivity, proximity bias, both in and outside of work, and addressing workplace culture to allow everyone to benefit. And again, the importance of active sponsorship. I like what Wendy had to say about unpacking factors impacting women and other diverse colleagues who are seen and how they are seen as leaders. And that organizations can make choices that are impactful, and the necessity to take multiple approaches. I also liked learning about the 50-30 challenge and how we can really impact change through those kinds of goals. I thought that Angelita's comments on differences of experience of employees and the gap in terms of colleagues thriving and the inclusivity and benefits and what we can do and the importance of pulling back stressors for women and diverse colleagues. We do have an amazing opportunity to do things differently in this post-pandemic world. Let's be bold and brave and seize the moment to create a more inclusive work culture where all colleagues feel a sense of belonging. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the members of the organizing committee. Their names appear on the slide. Your leadership, time, and effort in putting together today's session is truly appreciated and really inspirational to us all. I'd also like to thank today's participants who are attending both virtually, over 435 people, and in person today, over 75. Thank you for carving out time in your busy schedules to attend this session with us today. This concludes today's session. Have a great day, and think about what you can do to create a greater sense of belonging in your workplace. Thank you for joining us.
Say something. I love the socks, the men's socks, by the way. They're amazing. You need to get new socks.